There are four main skills that people usually talk about when talking about learning a language. For you, someone who's learning English, you probably already know what four skills I'm referring to: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Okay? These are skills that are involved in learning a language, and usually these skills are not all at the same level, right? For some people, they can understand a lot more than they can speak, or maybe they don't even know how to write in the language, but maybe they can speak it okay. So these skills don't just all come together and it's all one package, right? They are kind of separate, not completely separate. Of course, there's overlap, but they are kind of separate skills. They're all important. And so I wanted to dedicate a video to each of these skills. Well, not one video to each of them, but a video talking about each of these four skills, the importance of having each of these skills, and the importance of practicing with each of these. So this video will probably be a little more practical than some of my recent videos in which I talked more theoretically about different things. So this will be a little more practical, probably. And of course, remember, before we continue, click on that little notification bell so that you're notified whenever I release a new video. Okay? All right, let me start with reading. This is usually one of people's least favorite skills because, let's face it, nowadays in 2025, which is when I'm recording this video, you might be watching it later, but right now, reading is becoming just less and less of a popular activity that people do in their native language. All right. I'm sure many of you can attest to this. People in previous generations in your country might have read more books, novels, whatever, than younger people. Okay. And that's just kind of a trend that we're seeing all across the world. So if people don't really read as much in their native language anymore, you can probably safely say that in a foreign language, this might be one of the skills that they neglect, right? Or not everyone, obviously, but it might be the skill that people don't favor when it comes to language learning. So I get that, but I think reading is important when it comes to language learning. One of the best things about reading when you're learning a foreign language is it really helps you specifically with vocabulary. There's one huge difference between listening and reading when it comes to vocabulary, and that is when you're listening to something, if you don't understand a word or a phrase that's said, you have the choice to stop or pause the video, rewind it, or if it's an audio, then like rewind the audio to hear it again, to see if maybe you just didn't understand it the first time, but then you get it the second time or whatever, or maybe you can't even really picture how to spell the word that you just heard and you want to rewind it to hear it again. You have the choice to do that, but if you decide to do that, that takes effort, okay? If you're listening to a podcast for your English listening practice while you're driving, and you're in the car, you're driving in traffic, it's probably hard to stop and rewind and note down new words that you're hearing. You shouldn't do that if you're driving. So that's quite difficult in certain situations, and it just takes a lot of effort, right? And a lot of times when we're listening, we're multitasking. So I'm not going to say it's hard, because I think learning vocabulary through listening is fantastic, but there's one big advantage of reading, which is when you're reading, you're usually just doing that. You're not multitasking. And when you're reading in English for you, and you come across a word that you don't know, you don't have to rewind anything or pause it or scroll back on the little whatever that thing is where you I don't know the word in English, but where you're putting the part in the video where you want. You don't have to do any of that. You just stop, you see the word, you can see how it's spelled, you look it up, done, right? It's super simple to do that. It's something that just couldn't be simpler, right? When you're listening, it's not always like that. Sometimes, for example, if you're learning a language that has a lot of similar sounds, it can be hard to even know how to spell that word to look it up, right? I remember before when I was trying to learn Greek, Greek has some different letters that have the same sound, like the E sound, for example. And it's like, it was so hard to look up new words that I was hearing and get the spelling right the first time. So it always caused some problems in that sense. When you're reading, you don't have that issue. So reading is a fantastic way to learn vocabulary, in my opinion. It's also really good for noticing grammatical patterns, okay? I think when you're listening, you notice patterns intuitively. You kind of internalize certain patterns, like you reproduce what you hear, and that kind of helps you like understand those patterns. Like that happens to me where I just kind of say something kind of the way I heard it, and then it helps me kind of understand, oh yeah, I guess in this situation I use that pattern or structure. Like that kind of happens intuitively when you're listening, and that's really cool. When you're reading, you get to see things visually, and so I think that really helps you recognize certain things. That's happened to me where I'm reading and I notice like, oh, like I never really noticed that, this is this way or whatever. That visual element kind of helps you be able to identify certain patterns. So it can help you notice grammatical patterns. It just stands out more when you see it rather than just hearing it. So that's an advantage as well. I think that just working on your reading skills, being able to read in English in your case, obviously I'm saying English because you're learning English, but I'm talking in general about language learning. So when you read in English, when you practice this skill, you're gaining access to more of the language. What I mean by that is there are a lot of things that are just written down, okay? It could be in a book, information on the internet, whatever. But if you don't know how to read in that language, then you don't have access to that type of information. You can only use audio or video, and you're missing a lot of content in that language. Like, for example, when you travel and you see signs written in English, for example, if you're not good at reading, then you're not going to be able to understand those signs or the menu at a restaurant or whatever it may be. So you're not just missing out on content, it makes your traveling harder when you can't read. And I think this is especially true when it comes to languages that have a different alphabet or writing system than yours. So if you're a Spanish speaker, we've got the same alphabet in English. So this is not as hard, for example, as if you're coming from a language like, I don't know, Russian or Mandarin or something, where you don't have the same alphabet or you don't have the same writing system at all. And that element of learning this new alphabet, this writing system, that will always kind of be a challenge versus maybe just hearing something in the language or seeing something written in your own language, obviously. Like using a new alphabet can make it hard to read. I know people that when they learn certain foreign languages, they can understand well. They've done a lot of listening practice, but the alphabet just makes it harder for them to read in that language. It's more effort. And so maybe they don't want to put in that effort. And so they end up not being able to read very comfortably. But I think it's worth it to really put in the effort to actually get comfortable with the alphabet, the writing system, in order to have access to more content, get the benefits of reading, like I mentioned, with vocabulary and with grammar, and just reading in general is good for you. It's good for your brain. You'll be able to travel more easily in countries that speak that language. So a lot of benefits to reading. Let's move on to writing. So I think this is often the least prioritized skill, depending on who you are and your situation. If you're learning English because you need to work in English and write emails in English, then probably not. You probably prioritize this more. But for a lot of language learners, writing is the least prioritized skill because it takes a lot of work to write. I've been guilty of this before. I think up until recently, I didn't really prioritize writing in my French learning. So up until a couple months ago, I really couldn't write well at all in French. And just in 2 months, I've actually improved that skill a lot. So I'm happy about that. But I've been guilty of not prioritizing the skill in the past. But what happens if you don't write in the language, in your case, in English, is you're going to miss out on some different things, okay? Number one, when you practice writing in the foreign language, it gives you a deeper knowledge of the language itself, its grammar, and its pronunciation and its sounds too, okay? Maybe you think that a certain word is spelled a certain way because it has a certain sound. But then when you actually practice your writing and you realize, oh, wow, it's spelled this other way. I thought it was spelled this way. And you kind of make that connection. Oh, wow, that letter combination can have this sound in English. Interesting. It gives you more information about the language when you actually practice writing it and you get better at spelling, for example, and punctuation is a big one, right? So it gives you a deeper knowledge of the rules of the language, the sounds of the language. It gives you the opportunity as well to practice with more formal structures because, and not just structures, for a more formal vocabulary, because when we compare written communication and oral communication, usually written communication contains more structures and vocabulary that we tend not to use so much when we're speaking, okay? When I used to write essays in school, I would use structures and words that I don't actually say in my day-to-day life. Here's a good example. I probably never or almost never use the word although. It's a completely normal word. There's nothing wrong with that word. It's a great word. Everyone understands it. It's natural. However, for me, even though is the phrase that I'll probably use 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 times, just because it sounds more like the phrase I would use orally when I'm talking to my friend or whatever. Although sounds a little bit more formal to me, it sounds like a word that I would use in an essay, or not just in an essay, but you get my point. So if I just speak, or in your case, if you just copy the way I speak, you're probably going to hear me use even though 9 times out of 10, and although just 1 time out of 10. And so you're probably going to get the impression that, okay, even though is what I should always say. And that is the one that sticks in your brain. When you read and when you write in your own language or in a foreign language, you feel like you have more, I think, opportunities to use words that you might not use when you speak, or structures even. Like in my own speech, I don't think I ever really use the word nor, right? N-O-R. But when writing, if I were to write an essay or just whatever writing, I might use the word nor, but that's only going to show up in my writing. So writing in the foreign language you're learning, for you, English, will give you the opportunity to use words that you probably won't use when you're speaking. And structures too, like nor could come with a pretty interesting structure, like with inversion or whatever. I'm not going to get into grammar in this video, but you get my point. There are structures that sound a little more formal than other structures. Like, for example, I might say this in English sometimes, but most people wouldn't say this, like with whom, for example. Like most native speakers would never use that structure when speaking, but maybe when writing, they might use it. So, structures that you might not hear or say, you might be able to use them when you're writing. So you just get more experience with different structures, different vocabulary. I just think that writing gives you another way of communicating with people. Being able to write messages, like for me, like that's great. Now with my French tutor, if I need to tell him something, I feel confident that I can write a message to him when we're not speaking face to face. Before, I couldn't do that. So it just gives you another way of communicating, socializing. It's just a rewarding skill to have. I know people don't always prioritize this, but I think that it's worth prioritizing. Okay. All right. How about listening? So I'm the listening guy. Obviously, I'm a big fan of listening when it comes to language learning. For me, I still believe that listening, your listening comprehension and your listening practice, this is the majority of your foundation for a language that you want to speak. Okay, if you don't want to speak the language, if you just want to be able to read and write, okay, that's different. But most of you want to be able to speak English. I personally believe that listening is really the majority of your foundation for your language learning. I definitely believe that. I think it makes all of your other skills better. If you listen a lot, it's going to increase your vocabulary, which will improve your reading. It'll improve your writing. That'll improve your speaking because you have more words. It'll help you recognize grammar structures, which will help your reading, your writing, your speaking. You get the point. If you listen well, or if you do a lot of listening practice and then you can listen well, this is going to help all of your other skills. I think that just in general, the more you understand in a language, the more you know, right? You just know words and structures and patterns and things like that. It's pretty obvious. I've had multiple experiences with people who speak with me for the first time, or I should say this, the conversation they have with me is the first conversation they've ever had in their whole life in English, okay? Pretty cool, huh? They take a class with me and they say, this is the first time I've ever talked to someone in English. And all they've done is they've done a lot of listening, maybe some reading for the last year or last 2 years or something like that. And it's really cool because pretty much every time this has happened, the person has been able to hold a conversation well with me. Like we can talk normally. It's really cool. It's like, wow, this is their first experience doing this, and we can converse. Awesome. Like most people wouldn't expect that. They don't think that their first conversation with another person will go that well. But because they've done so much listening and it's been such a big part of just their learning experience, they've acquired so much vocabulary and grammar and patterns and all of that just through listening. That's enough to give them enough of a foundation where they can start speaking and have a conversation with someone. That's really cool. I'm not saying that you should wait 2 years before you ever have a conversation. I'm not saying that. I'm just trying to illustrate this truth that I've seen, that really listening can be the foundation for everything else in the language. And so I think that listening is super, super important. I think that it really is. I don't want to rank the skills in terms of importance, but listening is special. It's a special skill when considering the 4 skills, because when you can understand another person who is talking to you, that is like the most powerful thing when it comes to communicating in a foreign language, right? If you can write well, that's great. But if you can't understand, well, that might not get you very far. If you can read well, fantastic. But if you can't understand when a person's talking to you, good luck, right? If you can speak well, but you can't understand the person's reply when they're replying to you, well, your speaking's not gonna, do that much for you. I've had this experience many times where I talk to a person who has done a lot of speaking in English. They've practiced a lot. They can say a lot of things to me, but their comprehension is not very good. Their listening is not very good. And that is always a worse conversation than when I talk to someone who can't speak super well. They don't have a lot of experience speaking, but they can understand me well. That is always a much better experience and a much easier conversation than someone who can speak well but can't understand a lot. Like they know and they've memorized a lot of things that they can say, but they can't understand me. That makes it much harder. So I've always said this. I will always say it probably. I don't think I'll ever change my mind about this. It is more important for you to be able to understand the other person very well than to be able to communicate very well, than to be able to very eloquently speak and speak accurately and have all the correct words and grammar. It's more important to be able to understand very well. Speaking well is very important too. But if we're talking and you are making mistakes in your speech, but you can understand me, I don't care about your mistakes. All I care about is if you understand me and I understand you, okay? But if you can't understand me, then I can't really help you that much. I can slow down. I can try to translate the phrase into your language or whatever. But do you think that every native speaker is going to have the patience to do that with you and repeat themselves again and again and slow down and try to translate something into your language? No, they probably don't speak your language. They probably don't have the patience to modify their whole way of speaking. I'm a teacher. I can do that. But 99.9% of people that you're going to meet are not teachers. And so they're not going to have that experience doing that. Okay. So being able to understand them is actually more important, in my opinion, than being able to speak very accurately and eloquently in English, okay? However, there is a limitation if you're just focusing on listening, you're just focusing on your comprehension, you will face this challenge at some point where you start speaking and your speaking can only improve so much if you're really just dedicating almost all of your time to listening and not to speaking, okay? So I think at the beginning, really you can construct a great foundation with just listening or listening and reading or listening, reading and writing or whatever. But eventually, this is going to need to change and you're going to need to focus more on speaking. I don't mean more like you have to spend more time speaking than listening. I just mean the amount of time you dedicate to speaking needs to increase, okay? It needs to increase a lot, all right? Speaking, let's end with speaking. This is the most coveted skill. This is what everyone is trying to attain to. When we ask about people's language skills, we would say, what languages do you speak? We probably wouldn't say, what languages do you read, right? We say, what languages do you speak? Okay, that is usually the most coveted skill, the ultimate goal, to be able to speak to people, right? And some people would even say languages are meant to be spoken. I don't think that's always true. I think you can learn ancient Greek, you can learn Latin, and you're probably never going to speak those languages because they don't have any native speakers, right? Ancient Greek. I'm not talking about modern Greek, right? I'm talking about, Greek from thousands of years ago, or Latin, for example. You can learn those languages just to read, and that can be very rewarding. So languages are not only for speaking. I think it's a more accurate phrase to say, or it'd be more accurate to say languages are for communication, right? Whether that's oral communication or written communication, okay? So, but even I feel the prestige of speaking, the importance of speaking. Like this is really, if I imagine myself in the future with the different foreign languages that I've learned or will learn, I really imagine myself speaking them, right? I think most of you can identify with that feeling. So in some ways, this is the hardest of the 4 skills. I think you have almost no time to reflect, right? You're speaking, you can't really, do much with your brain in terms of, okay, let me stop here and think about this phrase and what I've learned and try to apply this rule. You don't have time for that. You don't have time for reflection like you do when you're writing, for example, where you can stop. Oh, let me look up this word. Okay, that's different when you're writing. Or when you're reading and you don't understand a word, you can stop and look it up. Time usually isn't a big factor. Or even listening. Maybe you're listening and you don't understand some words that the person said, but it's okay because you got the whole point. So it doesn't matter, right? When you're speaking, however, every little mistake you make is apparent. I'm not saying it's important. Like I've said many times, native speakers don't really care about your mistakes if they can understand you well and you can understand them well, okay? But when you're speaking, your mistakes are usually apparent to a native speaker. There's nowhere to hide. There's no refuge. It's not like listening where you can kind of pretend that you understood every word and it's okay. When you're speaking, there's no pretending. Either you say it right or you don't say it right. You don't have time for reflection. So many people think that if they just know a lot of grammar rules, they can apply them when they're speaking. Well, you can do that, but you're probably going to find that your conversations are very slow and the other person is not going to appreciate that you're taking so long to say one sentence. That's just not realistic. When you're speaking, you don't have time to go think of the rules, take one out, think of it, plug the words in, and do all that, at normal speed. That's just not possible, okay? There are a couple exceptions where you have a certain rule in your brain and you can kind of really quickly apply it and plug the words in, but in general, it doesn't work like that, right? You have to just go at normal speed and say what you know how to say and say things wrong when you don't know how to say them right. It's probably the hardest of the 4 skills. So there's a reason why so many people just complain about the fact that they can understand well, they can read well, but they just can't speak well. That's one of the most common things that I hear. And I think that more recently, I've thought more about this, about how speaking is just, it's something that we try in different ways to improve, and people look for different techniques to improve your speaking. And some of these things are helpful, some of them aren't as helpful. But at the end of the day, the biggest thing that really helps with speaking is speaking, right? It's actually getting that repetition of saying things, getting corrected by a teacher if you say it wrong, and then trying to say it again, and maybe you say it wrong again, and that gets corrected, and so on and so forth. But you say all these different things, and you get feedback, hopefully, if you're taking classes with a teacher and you're getting corrected, you maybe study your corrections, you say things again the next time, and maybe you say them better this time. And you just have to speak a lot. And that's another reason why it can be hard to see as much improvement with your speaking. That's because, you need more opportunities to speak, but that usually requires money, right? You have to take classes to pay someone to speak with you, or maybe you live in a foreign country where they speak that language, and that's great, and maybe you have more opportunities, but it usually doesn't work out perfectly where you can just talk to a bunch of people and get a lot of practice like that. So this is kind of the hardest one to train with another person, because like with listening, you can train it with another person by just listening to a video like this, right? Or you get my point. With speaking, usually you want another person to practice with. And so it takes more commitment and money, and it's just harder to find the time to practice with this. And I think that even though it's harder to find the time, to find the money, to do whatever, to make this a priority, we need to make it a priority. If you want to speak better, you have to speak a lot. You need to speak more frequently, right? You need to just get this repetition, fill in the gaps of things that you don't know how to say. When you start to do this, you'll realize, oh, I don't know how to say this. I don't know how to say that. And you fill in those gaps, you get corrected, and really like speaking a lot and, studying your mistakes and the new words and that kind of stuff, that makes you speak better. And yes, I think listening still helps you speak better just on its own. I believe that. But I think for the most part, if you really want to speak better, you got to speak a lot. You got to speak more frequently. Okay. So I talked about a lot here today. There's a lot more I could say about this, but I think I'm way out of time right now. So I'm just going to stop there. I might just talk more about these skills individually in the future. I just wanted to kind of give an overview of these different skills. Leave a comment down below. Tell me which skill is the easiest for you or the hardest for you. I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say about this. And I want to remind you that you can practice with my advanced podcast episodes. The link is down below to sign up for those. And I really encourage you to start listening to my US Conversations podcast, in which I talk to people from all around the country. It's a lot of fun. It's great practice for your listening. That link is also down below as well. Don't forget to click the notification bell so that you get notified every time I release a new video as well. Okay? All right. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll talk to you in the next one.